going to think the screen. So you can see this. Right. So I'm going to really very briefly speak about faith, sexuality, and theological perspectives on this, particularly highlighting what are perhaps the barriers within the context of theological education for honest, open, and perhaps prophetic discourses on sexuality and gender. But I would like to begin by introducing these two characters. Hello? Okay. I would like to begin by introduce Sergio and Bacchus to you. Sergio and Bacchus were early saints within the Christian tradition who were a same-gender loving couple. The story says that they cross-dressed actually, and walked through the streets of Rome and received a fair amount of derision for doing this in a very macho culture, perhaps in some senses, not in all senses. Their cross-dressing raised some questions, but they answered back by saying, this suffering that we have is nothing compared to the suffering that Jesus had when Jesus was on the cross. And in one of the earliest depictions really in St. Catherine's, in the first monastery really of the Christian tradition in Mount Sinai, we find this depiction of Bacchus and Sergio. And if you look, Jesus seems to be there in the background blessing their union. One of them died first and the other died shortly after, and they say of a broken heart. And when they went to heaven, unlike the other saint traditions in other hagiography, they are not reunited with God, but really they are reunited with each other. Given this question, we must ask, has the church always been homophobic? And the example of Sergio and Bacchus shows us really not. And if we begin to do historiographic work, historical work, we find that there are liturgies of same-sex union and the order for uniting two men within the liturgical traditions of the church, actually. Even today, we find that the priest, for example, in many of Anglo-Catholic traditions particularly, dresses up like a woman. If you pay attention to the vestments that priests wear, the chasuble, for example, or even the surplice is very daintily and delicately, ornately fashioned. As you raise in the church hierarchy, this is even more so. Just excuse me for a minute. I'm doing something. Thank you. Later. Sorry, my son needed something. Okay, so sorry about that. So as you raise in the hierarchy of the church, this gets even more so. So we know there's an injunction in the Bible that women should cover their hair in church, but the bishop, for example, wears a mitre, a cap which covers their hair in church, and it is really the priest enacting the role of the bride, because the church is the bride of Christ. So this gender fluidity really exists within the liturgical and historical tradition of the church, and even in the Bible. If we begin to scratch the surface a bit of many texts, we find that these are really texts that could be read in queer ways. I mean, I will give you two examples. The text of Ehud, for example, in Judges, and with the double-edged dagger, how he killed this king at that time, is full of sexual innuendos. And another famous story is about David and Jonathan. Saul promises David that he would give half his kingdom and his daughter in marriage if he killed Goliath. But at the end of the story, we find that actually it is Jonathan and David who actually share a kiss. So we find that the church has really had this long history of hospitable engagement. But then suddenly, homosexuality comes to be seen as something which is deviant, something which is perverse, something which lies outside the norms of acceptable behavior. And perhaps one of the reasons is because of modernity. Michel Foucault is well known to have said that before modernity, there was no homosexual, meaning that homosexuality as an identity arises only within the context of modernity. So what is this modernity that we speak of? And I want to highlight 3 or 4 things here. Firstly, it is the prioritization of the individual over everything else. And of course, this feeds into the notions of capitalism, where optimized individuals are seen as the ones who really have the purchasing power within the context of the market system. Secondly, Enlightenment notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity are really brought to the foreground. And then there is the rejection of tradition and authority. Of course, if you begin to scratch this surface, we would find that tradition and authority is replaced by a new one. So instead of the church, or instead of the king, the market has now become a new authority, and you can't question the market system. But modernity definitely had its effect on gender. And one of the things that it does in modernity is firmed up gender and sexual identities. Part of the ways that this was done was through census, through colonial systems of counting and exerting powers over the colonized. But this definitely began to happen. And there were ideological impulses as well, knowledge production, which was linked to the emergence of science as the only legitimate way of knowing. Now, I raise these these questions of modernity because if you begin to look at it, our theological education is invested in Enlightenment thinking. Our theological education is invested in this whole idea of modernity, in which we believe that if one has the right knowledge, one will therefore have the right action. The way that we look at biblical texts, the way that we study theology is all because of a particular Enlightenment tradition. Now, I'm not denying the Enlightenment. Enlightenment had a lot of positive values to it, but calling for what Spivak would say is using the Enlightenment against the Enlightenment, using Enlightenment values actually to deconstruct Enlightenment. And of course, as we all know, this has a fundamental shift in our relationship to nature as well. There are economic impulses. Capitalism and private property grows, and we find that now more and more engendered within our theology. Theology being seen as a private enterprise, religion being more and more relegated to the private sphere, and then there are political impulses. And part of the political impulses is the emergence of a centralized state. In India, more and more we see this, but the state actually has a great role to play in defining gendered and sexual norms. One of the first things that happens to us when we are born is we are given a birth certificate, and the birth certificate declares whether we are male or female. The state actually imposes a certain gendered identity and even sex identity on each one of us. And it, of course, continues in the making of passports, Aadhaar cards, voting certificates, etc. We continue. So what has the church done in this context? Really not much. I mean, the church has not really addressed the question of gendered and sexual identities. And we have moved from the bad, actually rejecting people with queer identities, to the worse, in the sense that in several cases around the world, the church has been part of movements to actually criminalize and to punish people with queer identities. And this has happened in the context of India as well. When Article 370 was being questioned, there were many voices from the church who were saying, no, we must continue to criminalize so-called deviant sexual behavior. But there are also a few good practices. And one of the spaces that I have found where there is has been a very, very good practice is in the context of the World Student Christian Federation and the Student Christian Movement. Of course, this is due to its unique position. It's not, it has a space. It's a Christian organization, but it has a space outside of the confines of the church. And now we find that NCCI is also very, very, very much been pushing this entire agenda of looking at the question of diverse sexualities, diverse genders, and, really doing very, very good work in making the churches aware of the issues and adopting a more affirmative and welcoming position. And so NCCI as well. And the Indian church, actually, in general, and I think we must take this into account, has had a significant amount of very good engagement with transgender folk. Somehow, the transgender question is much more acceptable to us, maybe because we believe God has made them this way, rather than, sexual behavior, which we say, no, it's part of behavior, not who you are. Whether there's an ontological part to this, I don't know. But the Indian church has had this very, very good engagement with transgender folk. When it comes to Bible and sexuality, the story of Adam and Eve continues to have a great amount of weight on how we see gender and gender relationships. And there are several things wrong with that story, of course. To begin with, Eve is seen, and as the epitome of women, then is seen to be simply a helper of men. It is a reversal of the natural order of things. Every one of us comes out of a woman, but in that story, a woman comes out of a man. And there are several things we know if you apply a hermeneutic of suspicion to that story, that several things that are very, very wrong with it. Even more so, within the biblical tradition, the story of Adam and Eve doesn't really hold as much weight as it does within the Christian theological tradition. In the Bible itself, it is a second creation story overrun by the first one. And then Adam just appears once more in the Bible. I think in the Psalms, he's mentioned again. The story is never referred to. It's not seen as a generative myth for the Hebrew people, rather the Exodus experience of liberation is. And so we must treat the story with a great amount of suspicion. Yet, within the question of Bible and sexuality, if you apply the hermeneutics of generosity, it shows us that there is a disruption between relationships. Disruption between relationships between men and women, between humans themselves, disruption in relationships between humans and the earth, and disruptions in relationships between humans and God. But still, the story continues to drive our understanding of gender, gender tropes, gender norms. So, in this context, how do we begin to speak about sexuality and gender within the context of theological education? The first is actually we must understand that the impulse of theological education, particularly in the given moment, is to regulate, control, and, this is not create, control and create compliance, actually, is what I wanted to say. I must have got distracted at some point. So to regulate, control, and create compliance. And I come from most of my life, I did teach in a seminary, and I saw this time after time after time. The whole idea is to create the same kind of individual again and again and again. Foucault, again, in his work on sexuality, in his work on madness, there's a critique which at the same time arises, which talks about in the time of Foucault, or just early in the latter parts of the 20th century, really, there was this entire impulse to take people who suffered, in inverted commas, from madness and put them into so-called normal situations, so in order to create compliance. And this was done through regularity, regular activities at particular times. And at the end of the entire process, when they had created now this normal individual, to present them to the general community in the context of a tea party, and perhaps now you can make connections with C.S. Lewis's The Mad Hatter's Tea Party, and present them as being normalized. And if you really begin to think about this, this is really what happens within the context of our seminaries. The bell in a seminary, the different kinds of bells that we have, whether it is the mess bell, the chapel bell, or the bell for class, creates a certain regulation and normativity that controls time. Any deviant behavior is immediately and quickly dealt with to bring the person into line. And then, of course, the creation of compliance. At the end of the entire process, we have a valedictory service before which there is a tea party. and everyone dresses the same, either in a cassock or in your graduation gowns, and you're displayed to the wider community to see the compliance that the institution has created. Connected to this is, of course, theological education and perhaps theological education institutions' commitment to caste and patriarchy. I mean, in any seminary that we go to in India, the seminary goes berserk if somebody in the seminary falls in love with somebody else. And if this love is transgressive, that is outside the bounds of caste and patriarchy, it even goes more berserk. So there is a general commitment within theological education to caste and patriarchy, which upholds these gendered and sexual norms as well. So how do we move forward? Perhaps there are three ways. One is to really have a robust theology of the body. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I'll just give you a simple example. I was talking to a student of mine many, many years ago, and he came out in the course of this conversation that before he came to seminary, he had never spoken to a woman who was not related to him. And so we are sending people out into the church to deal with men and women when they have not had any opportunity of having a relationship of any kind with someone from another gender, or perhaps not even aware of their own bodies. This is particularly true of women. I mean, women have been taught to, disdain their bodies, never find pleasure in themselves. And therefore, I would believe that theology should have a robust theology of the body, which enables healthy relationships with others, but healthy relationships with our own body. And in the process, enable us to find pleasure and be better lovers ourselves. Secondly, I think what we need is a robust feminist theology. Not the simple lip service to feminist theology, but a feminist theology that is conscious of its stance on the margins, continuously seeking to dismantle all hierarchy and power. And then perhaps this idea from Marcella Altus-Reed of doing theology without underwear. Doing theology with a certain sense of risk and vulnerability. And in this context, of course, ministering to the queer community as being important for us. And I'm going to skip over all of this because I'm sure I've gone over time, but I just want to show you this image. So what can theological education in the church do? I asked my students once, if you had to find Jesus today, where would you go? And surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, none of them said the church. Rather, we realized, and this is particularly true in the queer movement, actually, that comfort, that welcome, that affirmation, a sense of security, a sense of allowing you to be who you are, is in the context of the club, in the context of the gay club. In the Indian context, of course, clubs are accessible only to the wealthy. And this is the problem of queer identities in India, that they have a certain caste and class notion to it. So perhaps Jesus is to be found in the arak shops. Perhaps Jesus is to be found in that circle of rickshaw pullers who are sharing a bidi together. But even this is problematic because often these are gendered spaces which don't allow women. So it is up to us to look where outside do we find Jesus. And in that finding of Jesus, perhaps we find a new way of doing theological education, a new way of doing church, and a new way of doing ministry. Thank you.